So I want to take a couple of minutes to introduce to you Julie Schirmer. Hopefully a lot of you already know Julie. Julie is currently a behavioral medicine curriculum consultant and lecturer. When I was reviewing her CV, I didn't realize how many different institutions and medical schools she served as the faculty on. I'm not going to take your time going through all of them, but I would encourage you, go take a peek at her CV. It's awesome. She's had many awards in her career, including the Susan McDaniel Lifetime Achievement Award. She served on the Forum Planning Committee, and she's had many leadership positions at the Society for Teachers and Family Medicine, including establishing the Behavioral Science Family Systems Fellowship, and she served on the steering committee and as the director. Really interestingly, she served on the leadership team for the U.S. Vietnam School of Social Work Consortium. She's had many grants. She's served on many committees and been part of many, many projects. If I was going to put it into layman's terms, Julie is someone who sees a problem and starts to immediately think about how she can fix it. And I think a lot of us have that. What's so interesting about Julie is that, unlike me, she doesn't stop and say, well, maybe I'm not the right person to fix it. She dives in and goes out and invites others to help. And I have to say, Julie Schirmer, Sam Romano, Deborah Taylor, and Dennis Butler served that role for a lot of us mid-career folks and saying, come along, and brought us into leadership. And that's why I really wanted to invite her to come talk to all of you about leadership. Now, many of you may not have heard of JEDI leadership. I know I hadn't before we were preparing this presentation. Julie, welcome. And could you share a little bit about what is a JEDI leader?
That is someone who is an ally and an advocate for justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I am not yet a JEDI leader, but I have spent my career building skills and people around me to help me become a JEDI leader.
You know, that's such a beautiful segue into my next question for you, because the history of your development as a leader is such an interesting one. Tell me a little bit about those first steps into becoming a JEDI leader.
Before I even realized what a JEDI leader was, I was sitting at the dinner table, but I'm from this family of 5 children. I'm 4th out of 5. There are 2 boys and 3 girls, and there were some kind of inequities between how the boys were treated and the girls were treated. And so one night at dinner, I was accused of being a feminist, and I had no idea what that meant. So I went to my 4th grade teacher, Mrs. Bouchard, and said, I was called a feminist, and why would that be a bad thing? And Mrs. Bouchard convinced me that this was something to aspire to. So I recruited Mrs. Bouchard and other people in helping me. Fast forward to graduate school. So I ended up going to the National Catholic School of Social Services at Catholic University in Washington, D.C. After the first semester, I began seeing this pattern of how the classes were taught. And what the teachers would do is they would start out and say, here's the syllabus. Here are the 150 things that you should be reading. And how this is going to be taught is you all are going to be teaching it. Here are the different topics, and you choose what you're going to teach. After I had done that way too many times, I was kind of pissed off. I really wanted to learn from them. I had wonderful collegial students who were bright, best and the brightest, but I wanted to hear from people who had been in the field for a long time. We developed a committee. We surveyed the students about their thoughts. You know, were they thinking the same thing I was thinking? And my posse of partners, we actually met with the dean, and then they changed their expectations for faculty and how the courses were taught. That was when I really realized that I had a voice. The other thing is, when I was growing up, my best friend's brother had developmental disabilities and loved him dearly. I had an uncle who was maybe 10 years older than I am. He had cystic fibrosis. He was smart as a whip, but he walked and he talked very funny. And he even drooled. I think this was maybe in 5th grade. I was walking home from school as he was. We were crossing. And there was our neighborhood bully started teasing him and tripped him. I get tearful when I even think of someone doing that. I actually took this guy and I yelled at him. I said, "How dare you?" And for the next probably 10 years, this bully, who wasn't the best and the brightest, tried to beat me up. He chased me all the time coming home from school. But I could outwit him and I could outrun him. I've always been someone who tries to step up and stick up for the underdog.
That's awesome. So when you look around you, you see injustice, you see that things are not right. Someone has to step in. So why not you? And there was something about you, even from a 4th grader, that was like, yep, I got this. Now, not everybody starts with that courage. And I'm actually speaking of myself. I was always happy to do the work. I always saw the injustice. I always wanted to help. I never saw myself as a leader. I had to be invited. In some ways, even coaxed. You did that. You coaxed me. You invited me to participate in discussions about core competencies at STFM when, like 18 years ago, I was fresh, shiny, new with the worst case of imposter syndrome. You invited me to be part of the wiki, to be part of the fellowship, and others invited me and encouraged me to run to be a group co-chair, to write for publication, and to become increasingly involved in the forum. I never felt like I was the right person, and yet somehow found myself in a place of leadership and had to find my voice in different ways. Could you share a little bit for those of you who might be on my journey of not being sure? What are some of those key factors of leadership as you see them?
And before I do that, I just want to say that I do have that inner critic inside me. Just because I had a voice doesn't mean that I didn't have that inner critic. In terms of leadership factors, I have 8 of them. People usually can only remember 3 things. So if you remember 3 of these 8, you're doing okay. So the first is seek out and surround yourself with people who are passionate and skilled and who bring you joy, who don't drag you down. Somebody like you, Julie. When I think of my own personal League of Champions, I found Deborah Taylor, my cohort in crime in the behavioral science circles for almost my entire career. We banded together and created an annual retreat on the back deck of my house. And it became so big that we had to move venues after a while because we had people coming from New York, Vermont, New Hampshire. Another person who I drew in is Larry Bauer, CEO of Family Medicine Education Consortium. I basically stalked him on a plane ride at one of the conferences. There was a seat empty next to him, and I went and sat next to him and said, "Tell me more about FMEC." At the time, that it was Northeast Society of Teachers of Family Medicine. This was someone who had lots of energy, ideas, and I wanted to learn from him and get involved. Another example of that is one of my most frequently cited articles is an article on surveying communication instruments assessing doctor-patient relationships. How that evolved, I was relatively early in my career, and at one of the either regional or national conferences, I recruited people to do a half-day pre-conference on communication instruments. And we really realized there are many out there, but which ones were valid, reliable, and assessed what was important in the doctor-patient communication. So we looked at the Toronto consensus statement, the Kalamazoo consensus statements, and really we created this research project that looked at what were the top instruments. And this paper included Larry Mauch, Ron Epstein, Forrest Lang, and a researcher. Like, how could you go wrong in hanging out with those guys? So that's surround yourself with people who are passionate, skilled, and bring you joy. Second, this is a quote from Frances Perkins, who was the first female cabinet member under FDR and responsible for a huge amount of the New Deal programs like Social Security, child labor laws, minimum wage. She told her family, when a door opens, you must go through it. And there are many times, Julie, when the door opened and I wanted to run the other way. So when the door opens, there's two ways. One is when you're asked, when you're invited. And the second is when you see something that isn't right. So when invited, my examples are, when this team of Vietnamese visitors to our program said, Julie, we want you to join the US team to help develop family medicine in Vietnam. Talk about imposter syndrome. I thought, oh yeah, they probably ask everybody this question, but I'm going to take it at face value. And I said, I'd be honored. The second, they asked me to Femhai Zoom, sitting in the National University of Hanoi, a conference room with a physician and the past chair of the Communist Party, who was a psychologist. They wanted me to help them develop a doctoral program, the first doctoral program in Vietnam. I actually did tell them I was an imposter. I said, I don't have my PhD in psychology. I only have a bachelor's. Yet, what you need to consider and what's right for your country right now is to develop a master's in social work program. And here's why. And then we developed the first program in medical social work at one of the universities. And the other one is when Pham Hai Zoom, he was director of the research office connected to the Ministry of Health, asked me to write the first book on behavioral medicine in Vietnam. So those were all things that I wanted to run the other way, and then we did it. So the other thing is when you see something that isn't right and needs to be done. My examples, I think I sent you this story about sitting in a conference room at Bach Mai Hospital.
Yeah.
And Bach Mai Hospital was the hospital in Hanoi, where what they called the Nixon bombs bombed the hospital. And there was this memorial, this beautiful memorial at the entrance to the hospital for these 70 or so physicians, staff, and patients who had died. And this was my first trip to Vietnam, my first tour of one of the medical facilities. And we had to have our 3 cups of tea before our tour. For the third time, it had come up about the Nixon bombings. And I was sitting there feeling just so sad. And the air was so thick with, I think, trauma, guilt, sadness, all sorts of emotions. And I thought, oh, surely my US team leaders will address this. And no one said anything. So I actually mustered up my courage and apologized. I said, I'm so sorry that what our country has done to your country and your people, our country, our people. We are so honored that you have opened your doors and allowed us to help you develop family medicine and your health system.
I just love that story.
The air kind of lightened. They realized what they had been unconsciously seeding into all of our conversations. And I think that probably happened in the 12 years or so that I was in Vietnam, off and on. We were all better able to address the issue when it came up. the issue, meaning our past, our past history of being at war with them.
And it's such a beautiful illustration, although many of us won't be in such a prestigious opportunity, those little invisible pieces that the behavioral scientist brings to the team that other people aren't taking care of that allow the work to get done. And I hope that all of our listeners will consider their roles and their opportunities to make things better.
That is actually a really good point, because a JEDI leader doesn't mean that you become chair of the policy committee of your state social work or psychology chapter, although if you had the time and energy, you certainly could. But there are these little things that JEDI leaders do in their own circles to be a JEDI leader. So I'm going to go on to the third point.
Okay.
Taking risks. Take risks and don't be afraid to fail. Simon Sinek, who is an organizational consultant, he's got some great YouTubes and books, talked about kind of changing the language and talking about falling versus failing. And he says, fall fast and get yourself back up. And you can't fail or you can't fall unless you're pushing yourself and you're taking risks.
Right.
Failure can be messing up. I think of, for me, I know we're going to get to and talk about some regrets. One of my regrets is not perfectly handling toxicity within a group.
Right.
Having to really learn how to do that after totally mishandling, becoming defensive, and probably toxic myself. There's a wonderful book called The No Asshole Rule. And the No Asshole Rule is by a gentleman by the name of Robert Sutton. He put this book together, and it's very funny and it's very accessible, that basically talks about not tolerating bad behavior in a group and how insidious it is if you don't address that.
Right.
Because it can seep into every corner of your organization if you don't. So taking risks, whether that's presenting, whether that's addressing inequities, you need to take risks and then learn from it. The fourth thing, when time gets tough, breathe. Breathe more, seek to understand, and then organize your posse. And when I really think of that, I was one of the co-chairs of the Behavioral Science Collaborative. And they told us that the Families and Health Conference was going to be canceled. That was, this was the Amelia Island Conference.
Right.
This was where behavioral science devotees, allies, champions met together and for 3 days kind of supported each other, building tribes, building their posses, building their leagues of champions, and sharing and supporting each other. That was early in family medicine, and it was really needed at the time. But the conference was losing more and more people as demands on people's times became more and more constricted. And what we did on that famous back porch is brainstormed with Jerry Hepworth. We kind of seated Amy Romaine from afar into the meeting, Deborah Taylor, Bill Gunn. There were probably 15 people there saying, what are we going to do? And that's where the Behavioral Science Family Systems Educator Fellowship was created. And what's interesting when I look back, it was really important and time for behavioral medicine to be absorbed into the bigger organization, into STFM. And the fellowship became quite a presence in STFM. We banded with STFM, with the forum, and really became a presence so that eventually, 5 to 10 years later, the Behavioral Science Family Systems Collaborative became the second largest collaborative in numbers in STFM.
Right.
That couldn't have been done. We didn't react and get really upset. Yes, we did. Of course we did. But we were able to work with Stacy, Ray Rosetta, Dennis Butler to really create an amazing process.
Right. You created something beautiful out of crisis. And it's so easy to give up under crisis, to feel overwhelmed and to feel like you don't have a role. And I love your model. And I know that I've learned so much from watching you and other folks to just say, all right, let's just dive right in and find something we can recreate here, like the phoenix rising from the ashes. And, you know, our behavioral science group is so much stronger because of it. And I take so much joy in just kind of rehearing the story of how this happened.
Yeah, that was one of those occasions when I thought, really, on my watch, why? And it all worked out.
Yeah.
The stars were aligned.
Yeah.
And it worked out. When we were threatened, we rose to the challenge.
Right. And, you know, built something so wonderful. I only got to go to one of those families and health conferences because it was right about when I was starting, when it came to an end. And I brought so many wonderful curriculum things home. And it's my goal to make sure that the forum offers all the same things.
Well, you know, one of the things that was so powerful about that conference was you were assigned a small group of 10 people with a physician facilitator and a behavioral science facilitator that met 3 or 4 times throughout the conference.
Right.
Talking about either what they were hearing or what they were personally or professionally struggling with, mostly professionally. And it created these little tribes within the conference. And so taking that on a meta level, we transferred that process to the behavioral science, the BFEF fellowship. And really that has become a tribe building process.
Yes.
That lives on. So part of Amelia Island lives on through the fellowship.
Absolutely.
So I'm going to move on. The 5th one is know when to stand up, stand beside, or step aside. A good leader knows how to do this. And this comes from the Leadership Secrets of Attila the Hun. That's also one of my favorite books. And who wrote that? William Roberts. It's greatly written, but that's, you know, leaders aren't always being the champions.
Right.
They are not always the sage on the stage. Standing up is being a champion, but sometimes you have to listen and understand.
Right.
So standing beside, tell me more, all of those behavioral science sort of reflective listening, appreciative inquiry skills.
Right.
Laurel Milberg, another behavioral science great, always said, we oftentimes need to be the guide on the side versus the sage on the stage. There are times when we need to stand beside and collaborate with people. There are times when we need to step aside and let others do the leading. Let others hold the torch and carry the torch. That comes from Leadership Secrets of Attila the Hun. The 6th is be generative, identifying, recruiting, and supporting persons with the acumen, skills, and time to step up. Leadership within the BFEF, leadership within the Wiki. There are many mentoring programs within STFM that can help others do better. These can be students and faculty of all genders and discipline. And then the 7th is the inclusivity, and be intentional and deliberate about inclusiveness, both vertically, so making sure that you have diversity and diverse voices at the table,
Mm-hmm.
along with horizontally.
Mm-hmm.
So having diversity in all levels of management and leadership and decision making. So when we started the BFEF, we were very deliberate in who we recruited for the steering committee
Mm-hmm.
and for who we recruited as fellows. We wanted diversity in with all underrepresented groups. And actually, we had to work at recruiting men because a lot of behavioral science folks are women.
Right.
Recruiting people from different race and ethnicities,
Mm-hmm.
recruiting people with geographic and rural and urban differences.
Mm-hmm.
I think our first or second class, we had like 35 people apply and only 16 openings. So how do you do that? Intentional about inclusivity can also mean how you manage processes. I had a social work student who was one of the leaders for Primary Care Progress.
Uh-huh.
We developed Primary Care Progress, which is interdisciplinary champions for primary care
Mm-hmm.
in our medical school. And I was the faculty advisor for that. And one of my social work students was this beautiful, bright, 34-year-old Somali woman.
Mm-hmm.
Different culture.
Right.
And when she was in the room with all of our Tufts medical students, she was the Blackest person in the room.
Mm-hmm.
She went and got primary care progress training. She and two physicians went to this training and had a fabulous time, came back and were pumped. And about 3 months into our meetings, our process, she wanted to drop out. And I pushed her and I said, "What's going on? You were so excited." She said, "Well, I don't feel comfortable in our meetings." I said, "Tell me more about this." And what had happened, she would be in this room with 10 physicians,
Mm-hmm.
physician students from the US
Right.
who had lots of confidence. And Arala she wasn't the only person of color, but she was the only Black person from another country and a completely different culture.
Right.
And she didn't feel comfortable speaking up. I said, "How come? What's the difference? What was the difference during your training?" She said, "Well, people would look at around the room and allow my voice to be heard first."
Mm.
And so she was intentionally included. And I thought, duh. So the next meeting, I kind of took over.
Mm-hmm.
I actually, because we had the students lead, and I took over some of the process. And then afterwards, we did a plus delta. So what went well? What could we improve? And very often people talk about content on those plus delta things. No, I said, no, what did you notice I did? And did I do anything differently? So it came out, and these students will never forget that. Those students will be the best facilitators because they had no idea what the process before. And Arala had the courage to stand up and talk about it and talk about her feelings. Just being in the room and facilitating things differently. And that could be whether you're in a leadership position, whether you're doing research, making sure that you have principal investigators who are from diverse backgrounds.
Right.
It could be just being in a room and making sure the voices are being heard.
Mm.
And so the last one is you need to celebrate. Yes. So celebrate, meaning celebrating your any little victories, having dinners, celebrating with your tribe, nominating your colleagues for awards, and surprise. Go dancing, if you must, and play music if you must. Those are my 8.
I love those. And I love ending with the celebration. And you've always been so good with that. I know that you have some really important things to share about how the concept of psychological safety informs your methods of leadership.
Thank you for asking that. Just along with wellness, I heard this woman from the AMA talk about wellness for medical facilities, and we are all interested in wellness. And she had an 80-20 rule that, 20% was what a person's skills, practices, habits, etc. And 80% comes from the organizations that we work in. So 80% of wellness comes from your environment.
Right.
So Amy Edmondson is a professor at Harvard Business School and wrote this book, or this recently published book called The Fearless Organization. And she had this 2-year study with Google called the Aristotle Project, 15,000 employees around what the determinants and the factors that contribute to psychological safety. And hopefully we are able to share the link that you can go to and assess the psychological safety of any group that you're in. But psychological safety, how she would define it, is it's the belief that one will not be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, and mistakes.
So
and it is so very important. And I know if you think about the different groups that you have been in and the different areas of the hospital, in my career, some are safer than others. What are the key determinants and factors of psychological safety in an organization? And her 4 out of this 2-year study were: 1, attitude to risk and failure. How do you balance risk and failure with outcomes and bottom line? So what she recommends is that you need a true feedback structure. And if you think of our fellowship, after every process, we would do a plus delta of not only the content, but the process, and allow, what could we do better? Allow those voices and allow both the successes and improvements to come out. And without that, that just totally erodes trust and contributes to dangerous silence, simmering silence, and it stifles innovation, creativity, and success, I think. The second is being open and having open conversations and being able to address the tough issues, whether you do it well or not. They're all learning experiences. And without open conversation, you have simmering, dangerous silence. The third is willingness to help. And when I think of my time in family medicine, there are times when our staff and faculty were so stretched. I retired from my academic position the year before COVID hit. Well, I'm sure people were pretty stressed out at that time. We all were stressed out. An organization that has psychological safety, people are willing to contribute. If their workload is too much, that leads to burnout, right? Not only helping, but checking on others when they are not able to help. Checking on each other concerning their workload, their stress, their, what's going on. And then the fourth is inclusion and diversity. Goes contributes right into being a JEDI leader and being deliberate about that. And if you aren't deliberate and you don't have the first 3, that creates an us-them mentality. And sometimes I've heard that in behavioral science circles. It's an us-them, whether it's between our different behavioral science guilds, or whether it's between us being behavioral science and them being the docs. No, we're all one team. Inclusion, diversity, open conversations, willingness to help, and attitude toward risk or failure are all, to me, ring true for organizational safety.
Awesome. And, after our first conversation, I went out and bought all of these books, and I would encourage others to do the same. They are really useful in supporting yourself in situations where sometimes I don't know that I'm not supported, but I'm not overtly encouraged. And so sometimes you have to find that within yourself. You mentioned some regrets earlier today, and I was wondering whether you wanted to share a little bit more about those.
When I wasn't such a Jedi leader,
Yeah.
when I wasn't walking in the Jedi shoes, I had over 25 years as a behavioral science faculty in our residency program. And it took me a long time to really understand that these docs were not going to be doing family therapy, that they were not going to be doing cognitive behavioral therapy on their patients. And really, what they were really, really interested in, I mean, the first year is just don't want to kill anybody, right? What the majority of them needed was to be good physicians and have good medical skills.
Right.
And I can't remember how many of my failures of trying to get them to do these things happened. I think when behavioral science integration and primary care really, really gained a footing, it all started making sense to me. Oh, so they could know about it, but only the Mac Bairds of the world were going to be family therapists and family physicians. Second, when I wasn't a Jedi leader, I think it was last year, I'm on a number of research projects. One that we're just about to launch on mentorship. Another one is the oral history project of behavioral science pioneers. And a third one was on wellness, defining wellness. And I reached out to Jennifer Edgegoose, one of my teachers and colleagues, about getting involved and sending out an inquiry with the collaborative on underrepresented in medicine about mentorship. And she very graciously, but very pointedly got back to me and said, yes, I applaud you for trying, getting different voices to partake in this. Yet I can't do this because you don't have a diverse group of PIs. And we were all white women and one white male. It's, oh, you are so right. So we took many steps back and intentionally recruited Stacy Obaid and Kento Sanada. Kento was a third-year resident in one of the Pennsylvania programs, and Stacy is a fabulous psychologist from San Antonio. And we have a much richer series of questions and process because of that. So that's another one. I talked about my Somali student. Yeah. The other thing that I feel badly about is not consciously looking around the room after the end of the Families in Health Conference and look around the room and say, we've lost some of our leaders, and not reaching out to them. In my work with the Oral History Project, I unearthed a leader who left the national scene because she didn't feel included and invited. So I could kick myself for not doing that. So who's not in the room and why? So I could have reached out. So that's one of the regrets.
So to segue a little bit, one of the reasons I wanted to record this particular Zoom fatigue busting session was because I so often hear our colleagues put themselves down as only a social worker or only a licensed marriage and family therapist. What message do you have for those that think that way?
So there's a lot written on that. I actually have a great book called The Confidence Gap by Russ Harris. If any of you are acceptance and commitment therapy devotees. Russ Harris, I believe, wrote the happiness trap, and he also wrote the confidence gap. One of the things that I used to use with clients, I would use for myself. The name, tame, claim, and regain model. So naming and taming your inner critic, taming that imposter voice. Number one, recognizing it.
Mhm.
So that's the naming.
Right.
Taming is thanking your inner critic, thanking them for keeping you humble, for teaching you humility. Another thing is the concept of diffusion. Okay, so diffusion basically is separating yourself from your thoughts and letting them come and go. One of the things that I would do with patients is I would have them hold their fist up and put it against their face. And what do they see? Putting it in front of their eyes.
Right.
And all you see is your hand. And that you are fused with your hand. Your vision is fused with your hand. And as you pull your hand away, you can still focus on the hand, or you can focus on the surroundings. You can choose to focus on your hands. And in this case, that could be your inner critic, or you focus on all the other things around your hand. It could be your tribe that's supporting you. It could be your inner Jedi that is saying you are a powerful, reflective, strong person. So practicing diffusion. Another thing is expanding your world so that it includes everything, not only your inner critic, which has some lessons for you, because we are not all perfect, but allows other things in. So naming, taming, claiming your inner Jedi, and then regaining balance. So that regaining balance allows you to have the inner critic, but it also allows you to have everything else in your world. Developing a compassion and gratitude practice. In the past 10 years, that has probably helped me more than anything else, or helped my sleep, because my inner critic comes out in the dark hours of the night while I perseverate about all the stuff that I did wrong, etc. Gratitude and compassion practice helps that. And the last thing is, the more you accomplish, the more risks you take and are successful with them, those little successes helps temper that inner critic and builds the Jedi.
Yeah, I always think of that as being like you start to gather little pieces for your flotation device so that when occasionally you do fall, sometimes you do fail. When you try a lot of things, a bunch of them are going to fail. And so if you can have some things to keep yourself psychologically afloat, and those little successes are part of that. I know you had some other really good ideas about how we could help ourselves or help each other come out of that felt minus position. You had some thoughts about, organizational structure and how that helps people. Could you share some of those ideas?
Sure. Building your tribe, consciously building your tribe, whether that's being part of developing your own tribe in your own community, like our small community. Deborah Taylor and I started our retreat for just Mainers, then it became New Hampshire. And having those safe places where you can whine, your whining corners, your whining circle is fine, just as long as you don't wallow in the whiningness and move on. Go to organizations and processes that are kind of horizontally flat. And that doesn't sound like a fun organization. And what do I mean by that? So SDFM, for instance, is an organization that values all the diverse voices and has done things strategically to bring diversity into all aspects of the organization. Seek out your non-guild organizations that have a more diverse and honor diversity. It's also okay to have your own guild organizations so that you can whine, or your guild structures so that you can support each other and build your tribe, build strength in your tribe, so then your tribe can shine.
So as we come to the end of our time, I was wondering whether you have any last thoughts or ideas about JEDI leadership.
So as I said in the beginning, JEDI leaders are passionate allies and advocates for those who have experienced or who have been generationally disadvantaged. JEDI leaders enter life challenges with a sense of humor, fearlessness, and fun. JEDI leaders balance the person, the relationship, and the process. And without attending to any of those three legs of a stool, the stool tips over. A JEDI leader balances or reflects and learns from their mistakes and allows their light and the light of others to shine for the good of their community and the world. JEDI leaders tuck their inner critics away in the attic, letting them grow smaller in the dark and only bringing out when they want to and they need to, when they need humility, when they need to learn the lessons from their inner critic. The JEDI leader, when they fall out of balance, they breathe, rise, and shine. And if they still feel unbalanced, they remember the togetherness of their tribe and know others are breathing deeply for them.
That's wonderful. And that's the end of our time. Julie, I want to thank you for this wonderful masterclass, on top of all the gratitude I already have for all of the ways in which you have nurtured my leadership. And I want to invite our participants to share some of their questions, and we'll do our best with our